So right here at the last bridge to Vermont, as you can see, a strategic place today if you're talking transportation. The French constructed Fort St. Frederick, showing that it was a strategic place for them as far as transportation too, because we're in the north portion of the southern basin of Lake Champlain right now. And Lake Champlain travels south from here another 35-40 miles to Whitehall, which was at the time called Skeensboro, and before that it had a native name. I don't know what it was, but they built a trading post on the Vermont side first in the 1680s, and then later they would build Fort St. Frederick in the Vauban style, a star fort made of stone with a 4-story bastion mounting a dozen 6 to 8 pound cannon right here. So I'm standing on the top of the ruins of what was once a much taller building. This was 4 stories tall, and right now it's been reduced to ground level, really. So you can imagine I'd be another 35 feet high if I was standing in the original Fort St. Frederick. And you can see, even here, atop the ruins, the kind of command that the fort had over the narrows of Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain, which is about 150 miles long, comes down out of the north. It's a north-south running lake, and it makes an S-turn here. And then it heads south again in its south basin for another 40 miles. A strategic location if you want to defend what Lake Champlain is, which is a natural road connecting Canada. Montreal's right at the northern end of it. And the Hudson River, which leads you to New York City. This fort, in ruins now, Fort St. Frederick, was built here by the French to guard this strategic location. They built a Vauban-style star fort here, Fort St. Frederick. You can see the walls of Fort St. Frederick are masonry. They're made of stone. Stone lasts. When this thing was in its finished state, before it was destroyed by the French in 1759 to prevent it from falling into the hands of the British, the walls of this fort were in some places 20 feet high. They were tall and they were thin, and they allowed, with their parapet, infantry to repel any type of attacks upon them. Now, if you know about the French, they were perpetually at war with a group of native people called the Iroquois. They had fallen afoul of the Iroquois in the opening moments of their experience here in North America. The guy who gives his name to the lake behind me, Samuel de Champlain, had right here on Crown Point run afoul of the Iroquois. So we're entering the ruined fort here, and the state of New York did the original excavation of this fort in the 1960s, and they used a backhoe. And what's going on now is Syracuse University is sifting through the dirt that they removed, finding things like tomahawks and buttons and all kinds of good stuff that the earlier archaeologists missed. And I'm sure the Syracuse team will be mocked in another 50 years when better archaeological techniques come out. But the point is, archaeologists all have good intentions and they do their best. Here we can see probably a granary more than a magazine. They would tend to make them in brown. Right here we have a well, an old well that's been excavated. I love a good well. It didn't go all the way down, but you would like to. There's some good stuff on the bottom of that well. Frederick was originally built as a star fort, and in the style of Vauban. And Vauban is a French military engineer of genius who built star forts all over Europe. Star forts are awesome because if you build a fort square, the corners can all be attacked. They're very vulnerable. But a star fort has overlapping fields of fire. If you attack from any side, you're going to be enfiladed by the other point of the star. So this is a star fort. And what was particularly interesting about this star fort is it had a 4-story bastion facing the lake, mounting, I guess, a dozen cannons. But they weren't big guns. They were like 6-pounder swivel guns, pop gun cannons really, but cannons that could easily take out any native vessel, dugout canoes, birch bark canoes, or anything that the French at the time expected that the English might cobble together at the southern end of Lake Champlain. So they didn't have a fort here when they built this that was designed to carry the kind of guns that would ultimately be the end of this fort. See, when we look at Lake Champlain today, part of the natural invasion route between Canada and New York, it was a howling wilderness right through the War of 1812. This lake was considered a swamp, and I think a lot of people from New York still think it's a swamp. The French really didn't expect the English would be able to mount any serious challenge to them. They have a river that runs out of the northern end of this lake, Richelieu River, which brings them right to Montreal. Communications-wise, this fort is securely linked by other French forts, Isle-la-Motte, Ile-aux-Noix, St. John's, and finally Montreal. This fort will be perfectly safe from English encroachment. It's the English that are going to have to come up Lake George, over either the Adirondacks or the Green Mountains, through a howling wilderness, and they're going to have terrible lines of communications. The French never expected that the English would have any kind of ability to bring solid artillery against this fort. That was until 1759. In 1759, later in the French and Indian War, the last one, the Great French and Indian War, Fort St. Frederick would be destroyed by the French to keep it out of the hands of the British, who would then construct their own star fort in a modern style using earthen ramparts right over here, and that would be called Fort Crown Point. And it was built by Lord Jeffrey Amherst in 1759. So we're looking at a really strategic area, and this is what it looks like if you're on Lake Champlain moving along, with the New York shore on the left and the Vermont shore on the right. You can see the Great Mountains on the New York shore, and barely in the distance you can see the Green Mountains in Vermont. And you understand why Lake Champlain is so important militarily, because you couldn't move an army through those mountains. Small units, yes, but an army, no. From the position we're at right now, we're looking south toward Bulwaga Bay, which is right here. And you can see Crown Point's strategic position coming out maybe 2 miles from the mainland at the end of the central basin of Lake Champlain. You'll notice the bridge, the last bridge into Vermont right there, and that's where Lake Champlain makes a quick eastward hook before starting south again. And that area is tremendously important because not only to the French, it's important to the native people before that. Crown Point was used as a campground by bands of native people going to war or trading, moving north and south. Now remember that we're in the land of the Iroquois on the right here, and on the left, the land of the Abenaki. Okay, so over on the left, the Abenaki people, and on the right, the Iroquois. They're separated by a language barrier. Iroquoian people, or the Haudenosaunee, the 5 civilized tribes until they become the 6 civilized tribes, speak Iroquoian, whereas the Abenaki speak Algonquian. So this is a isogloss and language boundary right here, Lake Champlain. And Crown Point was fought over for thousands of years by these warring tribes. When the French tried to extend their reach south, they recognized this as the perfect place to build a fort, Fort St. Frederick. And it would be the center of French influence on the Northeast for many, many years. It caused all kinds of problems, from King William's War and the Schenectady Raid, right through Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and into the Great French and Indian War, when the French, after having defeated multiple British expeditions against it, were forced to blow it up when Lord Geoffrey Amherst's 1759 super expedition captured Fort Carillon, or Ticonderoga, to the south and came up the lake. The lake itself was home to naval battles long before Benedict Arnold and Macdonough fought theirs in the Revolution and the War of 1812. Native North canoes engaged in combat here, and the French recognized how important it was to build a navy and built 3 ships, naming them in English the Sturgeon, the Pike, and the Muskellunge, which is kind of fitting because I'm fishing right now, so it makes me think I need to catch one of those species. But Crown Point, from this vantage, you can see its strategic importance as the lake moves south, hooks east, and then goes south again. Sailing ships would have to make that cut, and it would be very dangerous. After excavating Fort St. Frederick in 1969 and creating this interpretive park, the state of New York did a pretty cool thing in my opinion. They left ruins standing in ruined form. You can just walk around like I did. There are some pretty cool little interpretive signs that'll help you get an understanding of the history as you walk. But you don't really need them. You can kind of feel it. There's a few places where you can feel it. This is one of them. And what's interesting is, if Fort St. Frederick and the colonial wars aren't your thing, you might rather check out the American Revolutionary connection that this fort has. And that's what we're going to do next.